All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ground Rounds for the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. It is my pleasure and privilege this morning to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Strober. Dr. Strober is the Resnick Family Endowed Chair in Eating Disorders, a distinguished professor of psychiatry at the Institute, consultant to the Youth Mood Disorders Research and Treatment Program, and director of the Eating Disorders Program at the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital. Dr. Strober has been a faculty member in our department for more than 45 years. He has more than 250 publications and boasts more than 30 years of continuous research funding. He is an international expert in both eating disorders and youth mood disorders, and we are so fortunate to have him speaking with us today. Beyond these many accomplishments, he is a cherished friend and colleague and mentor to so many of us. And so we look forward to his talk today. Just a reminder to all of you who are joining us, if you have questions as Dr. Strober is speaking, please put them in the Q&A. The chat is disabled. But with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Strober. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Welcome, everybody. Let me bring up my screen. Today, I'm going to be talking about lives that are lived at the margins. I became interested in the nature of madness and oddities of behavior, feelings of demoralization, fear, anxiousness, inexplicable self-loathing quite some time ago. And I've had the pleasure of working on the inpatient service for the last 46 years, which became my laboratory for the study of developmental psychopathology. My introduction to psychopathology occurred during my junior year at Queens College. Max Pollock, who was a clinical psychologist and research clinical psychologist at Hillside Hospital, was investigating the precursors of schizophrenia. And he spoke about this in his abnormal psychology course. And one of the high points of the course was his discussion of the Genane quadruplets. It's an infamous study. It was conducted at the NIMH over the course of 3 years. The lead investigator was David Rosenthal, who was chief of the Laboratory of Genetics and Psychopathology at NIMH. The Genane quadruplets were all diagnosed with schizophrenia in their late adolescence. They spent 3 years of very intensive study from 25 different vantage points involving psychiatry, psychology, social work, genetics, sociologists, biostatistics, social science, and physiology. Genane was obviously a pseudonym. It conjoined the Greek words genos and anos, which referred to dire birth. And indeed, their birth and their life was a sordid affair. The Genane's father was unquestionably mentally ill. And there were early indicators of their later illness, which Dr. Pollock had been studying during the course of his work at Hillside. They were passive, they were timid, they were unusually reticent, which we know to be precursors that are more typical of females at risk for schizophrenia. But beyond these sort of genetic temperamental traits, the home environment for the Genanes was horrifying. It was fear-ridden. In their early life, the father described knocking their heads together to prevent them from crying. When their mother finally said, "I've had enough and I'm going to leave you," he promised to mend his ways. It was short-lived. He also said, "If you follow through with this, I will find you wherever you go and I will kill you." The life of the Genanes was one of extreme physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and it scarred their development. So that it brings me to the focus today. How do our patients diversify over time? How does psychopathology diversify over time? What's the bridge between risk and resilience and the legacies of risk and resilience? How does this bridge to evolve adaptation? Psychopathology involves adaptations, intervening life events which skew development and bring forth maladaptation. I think I can say now that I was very fortunate to have a very, very broad education in my clinical psychology program at the University of Pittsburgh. I applied to 15 programs. I was accepted to 2, one of which was the University of Pittsburgh, the other was University of Cincinnati. My first year was occupied by an introduction to developmental psychology that was taught by Felicima Serafica, who was one of the first Filipino professors of psychology in the United States. Ping stood maybe 5'1", but she was a very, very commanding presence. And she said, you will not understand the development of the human conditions unless you think very, very broadly. And she spoke to us about the work of Nicholas Tinbergen, Van Frisch, Conrad Lorenz, who were awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine in 1973 for explaining the origin of a biological trait and behavioral expression. She said, you don't understand, and you cannot understand, you will not understand development in humans unless you understand the evolution of the development of the human species. And she made the point that Tinbergen had required 2 levels of understanding for how a trait works. One is approximate explanation, refers to the trait's characteristics, the trait structure, and the mechanism of its operation, and the evolution and developmental forces that maintain it due to its adaptive significance. In a bit, I'm going to be talking about I'm going to introduce several clinical vignettes that illustrates this point. I'm also going to be talking about the clinician's paradox, which is a failing to understand, or at least give thought to why complex symptoms require complex formulations. Kathy Lord, I don't know if Kathy is on the call, she has a very nice piece in the American Journal of Psychiatry that cautions against the assumption that a symptom is a syndrome, which is an indication of a complex psychopathology. That is not the case. And as to the paradox reflects the fact that psychological and somatic symptoms are indeed painful. They create burden, they're risky, they do accompany illness, and that is why they need to be treated with urgency. This is a justified command for clinicians, but they often succeed as defensive adaptations. And in this sense, they represent solutions to early life challenge and suboptimal preparation for later life transitions, which is why knowing history in every one of its little and seemingly inconsequential details is crucially important. Why does, I have to get rid of this. Why does misery persist? Why do some patients with severe depression actually resist or fear its remission? We've seen many of these cases on the adolescent service. And we can understand why some patients, this photo illustrating a young girl's manic excitement, why for some this is a welcome moment after months of despair. Manic depression is very often a biphasic illness, and the depression is miserable, it is profound, it is a painful despondency, and when it is foreshadowing a manic excitement, as it often does. The manic excitement is welcome. Well, why would somebody defend this? Anorexia nervosa is a strange ailment. We've known about it for hundreds and hundreds of years. And for those of you who have spent time on the adolescent service, we know that patients are often highly resistant to any increase in their body mass. They defend what is indisputably a dangerous condition. Anorexia nervosa has the highest standardized mortality of any psychiatric disorder. We know that the majority of patients die before age 40. Why would somebody, despite pleadings from loved ones, resist care? Several years ago, I gave a talk about anorexia nervosa, and it was really an appeal to understanding anorexia nervosa from a very, very broad perspective. I mentioned to the audience Melvin Konner's 2000 book on the evolution of childhood. He said the most powerful principles in nature and consider the development of children rest on the broadest empirical base, the elements of which we frequently overlook. And this is certainly true about psychopathology and therapeutics. I also showed this slide from Hippocrates. This is from On the Sacred Disease. He was referring to epilepsy. And Hippocrates said, there's no place in medicine for magic, God, or spiritualism. The sources of illness are in our environment and in our body. Beware of conjurers, purificators, charlatans who use divinity to cover their inability to afford any assistance. Constitution either shields us from the environment's ill wills, he's talking about resilience, or promotes disease. He's referring to risk and vulnerability. I said to the audience that there are vital questions that have to be considered about anorexia nervosa in the same way that they have to be considered about all complex psychiatric phenotypes. How does the mind evolve? What accounts for the emergence of psychopathology? How do maladaptations form and survive? Why are single paradigms not universally effective? How should we properly consider the prospects and also the caveats concerning evidence-based treatment, and what is sometimes asserted as established science or specialized knowledge when those assertions are provably false? And I told the audience about my first year developmental psychology course that emphasized the importance of understanding a life history, that to understand a life history, you had to understand how social sciences and natural sciences are linked, that in non-human animals, socially induced adversity is a model for the developmental risk in much the same way that we see it in humans. All of this was purposeful, given that I knew the audience I was speaking to. And I said that anorexia nervosa behaves in the same way that Ted Reich and John Rice said in 1973 that any complex psychiatric disorder behaves. They are multifaceted, they are non-Mendelian, they have a polygenic architecture, and the liability can be considered as illustrated in this depiction of liability of complex disorders where heredity does matter. And at some point, genes and environment interacts in ways we don't fully understand. And we decide there is a threshold after which a phenotype is determined to be affected. And that point of affectation is determined by a bunch of people who sit in a conference room and determine how many traits, how many symptoms define a diagnosis, which is an arbitrary concept. I told the audience about the extended evolutionary synthesis, illustrating the importance of environment and biological information. We know now that biological information is transmitted by DNA sequences, but we also know that there are non-genetic effects. They're epigenetic, they're ecological, they're cultural, they're parental. And these effects, along with our DNA sequences, determine how evolutionarily conserved phenotypes, for example, phobias, compulsions, obsessions, and life history outcomes are determined. I mention this very specifically because we know now that the architecture of anorexia nervosa is characterized by polygenes that have been associated with phobias, compulsions, obsessions, and also with certain metabolic traits. So coming back to the clinician's paradox, I also told the audience that we see this in medicine. Evolutionary medicine, which is coming into vogue, made the point that fever is an evolved adaptation. It's not singular. It's a valid indication of disease in some instances. It's aversive, we treat it. We take Tylenol, we take Aleve, but it's not so simple. Zing and Abele showed in 2007, and I know this may seem a little obscure, but I'm going to come to the point that increasing temperature activates an evolutionarily conserved shock protein pathway that enhances immunity against pathogens. They illustrated this in invertebrates, but there are multiple defensive adaptations that are part of the human condition. DNA is an environmentally signaled molecule. It's a relational molecule. It's an environmentally empathic molecule. And epigenetic memories quickly attach to our experience, and they can endure a lifetime. I got to the close of this presentation by saying, whether we're talking about simple behavior or complex forms of behavior, the machinery that drives a life history is highly sensitive to the environmental signals that edit DNA in ways that can either improve or constrain an individual's fit to its surroundings. I mentioned work by Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan that showed, and they showed it brilliantly, that if you shift the environment's emotional ambience from the familiar to the unfamiliar, cellular anatomy in the brain's motivational structures recode so that the human being is better attuned to imminence of threat and readiness for avoidance. The purpose is to restore a more secure environment and to tune the motivational anatomy to it so that we can either avoid or approach consumatory action. Consumatory action. And this is why I emphasize to the audience the importance of complex ideas to the enigma of anorexia nervosa. Development is not one-sided. It depends on how our life is poked. We can move in one direction. We can move more strongly in another direction. And why Wallace Arthur, in his 2004 book, Biased Embryos in Evolution, said, bearing this complexity in mind, in the world of life, beware of generalization. It may be science's duty to attempt them, but they're often wrong, or at the very least subject to if, buts, and expectations. Anorexia nervosa is believed by many to be a genetic disorder, a genetic disorder. And if you think otherwise, you're a bit of a heretic. So when I made the point that it is important to understand what presages the emergence of anorexia, it's because historical events, whether they are favorable or disadvantaged, prepare us, they prepare our patients, they prepare people with anorexia nervosa too for change, either by optimizing life's adaptations or compromising and constraining it. And we see this in every science. historical analyses are crucial to physical and cultural anthropology, paleontology, zoology, organic and cultural evolution, evolutionary genetics, behavioral ecology, developmental biology, and psychopathology. And to the degree that this is indisputably true, variations in the life of our patients, whether genetically formed or environmentally determined, explain why single paradigms don't work. Well, this was the reaction. Family and twin studies support a genetic basis. It's all about amino acids. A former colleague of mine said, we need to stop blaming the parents for anorexia nervosa, which is another comment from the audience. Patients don't need psychotherapy. Psychotherapy does more harm than good. I was called a Freudian quack, as though Freud didn't know a thing or two about a thing or two. And didn't I know that anorexia nervosa is a genetic disorder? It's a brain disorder. Well, I was a bit taken aback by this. I reminded people that, in fact, I was one of the 5 investigators who formed the Eating Disorder Genetics Work Group in 1995. And I didn't forget that I was aware that anorexia nervosa had something to do with genetic variations. In fact, many years before I gave this talk, there was a paper published in the Journal of Psychiatric Research, which is the first attempt to examine the familial transmission of anorexia nervosa and the degree to which it clustered in families that suggested multiple causes of variance were at play. But that to say that anorexia nervosa was a genetic disorder and to imply that nothing else matters is a misunderstanding of genetics. A friend of mine looked at the presentation before I presented it, and I said, this is a slide I wanted to present, Craig. These are comments that came from Theodosis Dobzhansky, whose 1937 book, Origin, Genetic, the genetic evolution and origin of species, which is considered one of the most important works to come out of the modern synthesis. I felt I wanted the audience to understand what Theodosis Dobzhansky understood very, very well. No evidence is powerful enough to force acceptance of a conclusion that is emotionally distasteful. And the role of environmental factors, the role of environmental processes within family life is something that is very, very distasteful to a group of people who claim to have specialized knowledge and who believe that there is a single gold standard therapy for anorexia nervosa. I was certainly aware that biology is important to the human condition, but I wanted to tell the audience that it's intellectually satisfying. It can inspire science because of the concreteness of the idea of genetic causation of mental illness. But what Dobzhansky said was that without the light of evolution, biology becomes a pile of sundry facts. Some are interesting, some are curious, but they make no meaningful picture as a whole. I wanted to say that you're asking for pat answers to complex problems, but this is the hallmark of intellectual mediocrity. My friend said, it is a bad idea to present this slide, Michael. But I did make the point that whether it's by accident, it's by random change, in any delicate mechanism, and of course, child development, embryonic development is a delicate mechanism of life, you can hardly be expected to see it improved. You can poke a stick into the machinery of one's watch or one's radio set, said Dobzhansky, but will seldom make it work better. Well, the audience wasn't pleased, but I said, I read very long ago what it was to ignore, what it meant to ignore life history, that there were hazards. And this came from David Hume's 1748 thesis, An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Hume said, it seems impossible that what has escaped so many is very obvious and easy, but it was a hard sell to this audience. I came to UCLA in 1974, joining faculty in 75 with an interest in mental illness and melancholia and psychosis, anxiety, fear, mental anguish, in developmental psychiatry, which I credit to my mentor at Queens College, Max Pollack. But I became very interested in what is psychotherapy and how should it be properly considered. And I was very interested in the necessary language that makes psychotherapy important to patients. My first day at the University of Pittsburgh, I was handed, or we were handed, a 35-page syllabus. And we were told, read it because it's going to be part of your doctoral exam. And on the syllabus was classics by Robert Burton, his 1621 monograph, The Anatomy of Melancholy, Eugen Bloyer's monograph on dementia praecox, and the group of schizophrenia, Emil Kreplin's 1990 monograph on dementia praecox, his 1921 monograph on manic depressive illness in paranoia. I had an early discussion in 1975 with my office mate, Gabriel Carlson, who went on to chair the Division of Child Psychiatry at Stony Brook, along with our mentor, Denny Cantwell. We asked the question, is the scientific understanding of adult affective and psychotic applicable to young patients? This is the frontispiece of Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. It's really quite an extraordinary text. The etching illustrates what Burton believed to be the multiple complexities of a melancholia. And that was implied by the book's actual full subtitle, which you couldn't see, but I'll read it to you. The Anatomy of Melancholy, what it is, colon, with all of the kinds, causes, symptoms, prognostics, and several cures of it, in three main partitions with their several sections, members, and subsections, philosophically, medicinally, historically, opened and cut up. This is what Burton said about melancholia. And when I read this, I really began to understand the importance of understanding the mind's subjectivity and how to describe the psyche's phenomenology. Said Burton, melancholy is either in disposition or in habit. In disposition, it goes and comes upon every small occasion of sorrow, need, sickness, trouble, fear, grief, passion, or perturbation of the mind, any matter of discontent or thought, which causes anguish, heaviness, and vexation of spirit, that is dull, sad, ill-disposed, solitary. And from melancholia dispositions, no man is free. I would also add, no child is free. Melancholy, in this sense, is the character of mortality, a habit, a serious ailment. And as it was long increasing, we do see melancholy in children. So now being grown to a habit, it will hardly be removed. Some of you know this case, and some of you have heard me say that there is no greater scourge on the life of a child than to come into the world with a melancholy disposition, anxiousness, a constant foreboding, because it is the beginning of what emerges, particularly around early adolescence, as an extraordinary, difficult to reach, difficult to dispute self-loathing. LM is 11 years old, or was 11 years when she came to us. Her early years were marked by worries and fears. She had unmistakable generalized anxiety. Several years later, convinced beyond reason she's responsible for the sudden death of her mother, which she witnessed, she insists that her life will be forever dark and foreboding. This is a quote. "I'm a realist," she said. Her capacity for language, metaphor, imagery has little relationship to her chronological age. And we saw this illustrated in the interviews that we conducted with her. When I first met her, in response to my comment, it must be impossible to live a child's life when your mind perceives and experiences the world as it does, as if you're a shrewd, unusually insightful adult. That was my language, and it was intentional. Her response is, "People tell me I'm an old soul, but sometimes adults speak to me as if I'm feeble. Maybe it's better not to have a soul. Maybe I'm just tricking myself into thinking I'm unique. Maybe all I am is a fraud who doesn't see how I really am. If I'm what everybody says, why couldn't I save my mother?" What she did say at another time, "The reason I lose weight is so I can get into a small box and join my mother." In our first meeting, she said, "Everything turns to death, so what's the point?" What do you say to that? And I'm reminded again by Hume's inquiry concerning understanding. There's a passage in which he refers to the innate faculty of instincts which both beasts, he's referring to non-human species, and humans share. It's the ability to reason by experiment. This is 200 years before Pavlovian conditioning. But humans, he said, are unique. They have breadth and depth of memory and attention. They make deductions and long chains of thought. Humans grasp new ideas, but stubbornly insist on the defense of old ones. Humans have the capacity to worry by conflating unrelated circumstances. I deserve death because I couldn't save my mother at the young age upon her death. Humans have a greater inner library of analogies to reason with. Humans detach from and they can scrap biases, but they also gain from the experience of others' testimonies, said Hume, foreshadowing contemporary reviews of what neuroticism is and how it forms the causal mechanisms underlying constant, self-perpetuated, self-generated thought. And we've now seen a number of these patients. I'm going to be reading some additional vignettes, but they all underscore the following points. And it seems esoteric, but natural selection brought us to who we are. Natural selection moved us from very primordial organisms to the exceptionality that defines human life. But it also left us, or left some of us, with vulnerable trade-offs. The synthesis has been discussed by Bateson and Lalonde, and they say adaptations that worked well in ancestral environments were archived in the human genome because they prepared us for the realities of early life, but then they become poorly suited to the realities of modern life. We think of depression, we think of mania, we think of sadness, we think of self-criticisms as psychopathologies. They are, but they're also adaptations. They're adapted, they reflect the adaptiveness of symptoms. There's an excellent monograph by Keller and Ness in 2005 that's illustrative. For example, sadness is sometimes adaptive in the sense that it motivates the avoidance of actions that might result in future losses. We cry to elicit an empathic, comforting reaction from others. We have self-reproach because in evolutionary times, it might have been a signal of culpability that helped maintain a presence in evolving social networks. Fatigue that you see in melancholia, and you see it to a very profound degree, might exist in adaptation because it maintains resources by suppressing energetically costly pursuit of goals in an unfavorable environment. These are cautionary phenotypes, and they have an evolutionary history. On the importance of knowing detail, its trajectories, its complexities. Let me read some of these vignettes. RW is age 14. She was admitted to our inpatient service for a very sudden onset of anxious preoccupation, vague fears, inability to sleep, believing she was losing her mind. She has never experienced anything like this before. Prior to her admission, she saw a therapist who suggested DBT, and this is quoting, which can help you learn how to regulate your emotion and avoid self-harm. R's mother told the therapist that R's father had been treated for bipolar illness and that his episodes seemed much like what R was now reporting. The therapist replied, "Oh no, she's too young to have bipolar illness, and this seems more like panic disorder." The therapist also said that mania has a longer duration. She's had this only for several days. M is age 23. She was referred to us by an evidence-based treatment center for eating disorders. Some time ago, her weight rapidly dropped from 140 to 90 pounds at a height of 5'8". She developed frequent binge eating. Her weight then climbed to 160 pounds. She has always been slender. In seeking relief of her binge eating, she is told that the center does not believe in weight reduction. We believe in life at any weight, life at any body mass, and that she has to learn to love herself. And she thought that this was very strange. In consultation, she revealed that her home life was chaotic. Her mother worked incessantly, was neither expressive nor affectionate, that her father was unpredictably explosive. She also said she was never able to attend to her teachers, and this went back years. Her self-loathing permeated her life as far back as she could remember. When asked about other traumatic events, she whispered she had 2 sexual assaults while intoxicating. I asked whether this was ever taken up by the empirically supported treatment she said she needed. She said no. She said binge eating needs to be suppressed before I was able to move forward in understanding anything else about my life. When she was told that there was nothing illogical or counterintuitive or evidence-based about wanting her body to return to its natural weight, she was stunned to hear this. She was stunned to hear that her attention deficit disorder could be managed simultaneously with her binging, and there were a variety of well-established pharmacotherapies that could help her. Age 14, became gradually withdrawn, sluggish, indifferent to her schooling, avolitional, unresponsive. It was asserted by a university neurologist that a brain tumor was likely. A subsequent consultation said it was the result of her weight loss, and because she had anorexia nervosa, restoring her weight would be a likely remedy to her mental state. She was being treated for anorexia nervosa by a university that will remain nameless, located just north of San Francisco, just south of San Francisco, not far from San Jose. And what went noticed by the people to our north were delusions of guilt and punishment, and very brief moments of what was described as feelings as though her thoughts were painfully intense. They came too rapidly for her to know what they were saying. She said at these moments, which occurred prior to her initial weight loss, she thought her brain might explode. Her mother thought it was important for us to know that her father had manic depression, was helped only by tranylcypromine. There are other vignettes, but I want to come back to what Leo Kanner said in 1935 about classic illnesses of mood. It appears in his 35 and then second edition, 1947 textbook, Child Psychiatry. We know Kanner, who's considered the father of modern child psychiatry through his class, his seminal paper on autism. But we also know that the greatest frequency of first attacks of mania occurred during the period from age 15 to age 20. We also know from Kreplin, who believed that manic depressive illness was a single morbid state. There's some controversy about that, but what he said was that it included the whole domain of classic periodic circular insanities, simple melancholia, simple mania, but also slight colorings of mood, some of which are periodic, some of which are continuously morbid. He said manic depression is an illness of varied character and composition. And sometimes these expressions not only pass over the one into the other without boundaries that are recognizable, they replace each other in one in the same case. The importance of delusional depression, severe melancholia marked by impairments in motor functioning, disability of behavior to an extreme degree, was illustrated by Gay and I in 1982. It was further identified by Hagapakiskel in 1983. Both studies showed that the switch from unipolarity to bipolarity was predicted by short latencies from onset to full syndromal intensity of depression, morbid delusions of the sort you see in severe depressions, and importantly by psychomotor retardation, which can also manifest as stupor and catatonia. In 1995, Akiskel showed that earlier age at the onset of a depression, delusions and hallucinations of a morbid nature, protracted length of depressions, a shorter well period, meaning the period from the end of one episode to the beginning of the next, level of impairment that is truly extreme, and in the depressed state, variation in mood and a feeling of greater energy within episodes, and also daydreaming, that each was a predictor of later mania or hypomania. Jess Fedorowicz said the same thing in 2011. One of the wisdoms of the course and outcome of bipolar illness in youth, which collected a sample of 435 children and teens with some form of rigorously defined bipolar illness, including what Kreplin said was the importance of taking note of the slight colorations of mood change. We referred to this, for lack of better terminology, as bipolar illness not otherwise specified, which was one or two clear, unambiguous symptoms briefly expressed, less than 4 days of hypomania. One or two symptoms with duration within a couple of days to the maximum. And we asked the question, over time, does this foreshadow the emergence of classic syndromes? Our sample has now been studied 20 years. They are all adults. And we plotted the conversion from this slight coloring of a hypomanic-like feature. Remember that vignette of the 14-year-old girl who came to us and said, there's something wrong with my mind. She had only been ill by the mother's account 2 days. And it was very clear to us that she was in the midst, although very brief, of what is likely to later emerge in more clinically discernible fashion. Over the course of several years, the conversion from this slight coloring of mood to bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 is very impressive, extremely impressive. We now have 20 years worth of longitudinal prospective data. And in terms of prospects for the future, we recently published a risk calculator that was designed to predict the individual risk of conversion from sub-threshold symptoms to full threshold manic depressive illness, and also the prediction of mood recurrences via a risk calculator, which we recently validated in an adult sample. So there are prospects. The prospects are a better understanding of what we ignore, or at least some people ignore. Some people have little understanding of, rarely inquire into. And the future will be, I think, earlier identification of illness psychopathology that is impairing, that requires a broad understanding. The future is going to allow us to identify very unique biological pathways, because there is not a singular biological pathway to any psychopathological condition. There are common and unique genetic variations within population. This will be necessary if we're going to move forward with precision medicine. There are sex-dependent and non-shared genetic architectures. I reminded the audience that anorexia nervosa is comprised of genes that confer to the symptoms, but those same genes are associated with compulsions, with neuroticism, with full-fledged anxiety disorder, and with genes that predispose to low body weight and very rapid weight loss. Identification of subphenotypes within clinical groupings. And there's design of randomized clinical trials that pay attention to recruitment of individual factors that determine effects that are variable specific. Very few clinical trials have attempted that. We're 10 minutes before the hour. There are other vignettes, but I'm going to now go to the questions. So Tara, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was a great talk. We have a number of questions that have already come in. The first one to get us started, and I should just say, please feel free to add your questions under the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. The first question for you, Mike, says, great talk. How would you explain why anorexia seems to occur less frequently in lower income countries where there is food insecurity?
It's a relevant point because we have never really studied anorexia nervosa in populations where food insecurity is a reality. There is one seminal study that examined prospectively a population prior to the introduction of elements of westernized society, and then subsequent to the introduction of mass media. And it showed an uptick in dieting behavior, but it showed no change in the occurrence of anorexia nervosa. We do know that anorexia nervosa and binge eating disorder in particular occurs in non-white populations. It occurs in Blacks, it occurs in Hispanic females. On any one day, Hispanic females with anorexia nervosa occupy between 30 and 50% of our population. So there is no question of cultural and epidemiological factors that are associated with anorexia nervosa. And if there is no concept of weight loss, if there's no concept of dieting, presumably anorexia nervosa would be protected against.
We actually have a second question along similar lines, but with a slightly different component. The next question asks, how have the developmental trajectories of anorexia nervosa changed over time? And has that differed across cultures?
Going back to the importance of history, the first depictions of anorexia nervosa in medical history is attributed to a monograph on tuberculosis. There were 2 case vignettes. That monograph was published in 1671. And in it was stated that these cases, although they physically resembled cases of tuberculosis, the distinction was based on the fact that these 2 individuals had passions of the mind. And there was a depiction that suggested that the trajectory as it is known today, anxiousness, discipline, timidity, sensitivity to the environment, difficulty with change, sensitivity to the needs of others, an aversion to self-needs or the acknowledgement of self-needs, was understood. As far as the role of culture, there are no studies that I know of that examine the trajectory of anorexia nervosa across different cultures. However, in the cases of anorexia nervosa that we've seen in our Latina girls, in several of our Black young women, the trajectory is identical. The trajectory toward anorexia nervosa in males is exactly what you see in females.
Thanks, Mike. We have one more question. And again, we're approaching the hour, but if others have questions, please send them now. The next question says, sometimes gene by environment interactions are hard to actually demonstrate in research. An example is major depression. Meta-analyses of the Caspi-Moffitt findings on serotonin transporter genes indicate a strong effect for environment, but little effect for genetics. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, and I'm aware of that. There have been rebuttals, and the rebuttals have to do with the kind of depression we're speaking about, and the difficulty in samples of very small size to identify genetic effects. When you look at GWAS studies of schizophrenia, for example, when you move from a sample size of 5,000 to 10,000, and then from 10,000 to 25,000, and from 25,000 to 35,000, and from 35,000 to 40,000, what you see is the Manhattan plot. Those are spots along the entire genome that's associated with caseness. That skyscraper-like depiction begins to become increasingly prominent, underscoring the importance to genetic studies, including an attempt to identify gene by environment interaction, which is, as you said, extremely challenging. But as GWAS studies increase in size, that Manhattan plot, which sort of looks like that across the genome, rises so that those areas of causal, the location of causal genes, become increasingly more prominent. I'll just add that if anyone wants to stay past the 10 o'clock hour, I will do so and take your questions.
I have one question. I do have to hop off at the hour, but I'm interested at, I think your talk has done such a nice job of highlighting the importance of environment and the importance of attending to early life experiences. I'm wondering how you approach that clinically and work with the family, particularly when some of the salient or kind of pivotal events are in the past and there's no undoing them. How do you highlight those in your work, and sort of what's the mechanism for change that we look to affect, symptom improvement?
it's important because in the case of anorexia nervosa, it is argued that family environment should not be scrutinized because there's a gold standard approach. And in that gold standard approach, family environment is irrelevant, and that parents are the best options for the child's weight restoration. And in some cases, the role of the therapy is to be relegated in significance. But as to your general point, in my own work over the years, in the patients we see in the inpatient service where family environment is quite prominent and quite problematic, we address it very early on. It is part of our history gathering. We don't wait for history gathering. We move from day one and we address the things that need to be considered in the formulation we present to our families. And with very, very rare exception, the families embrace it. We address what we need to address individually with parents. We address each parent separately when that when there is an indication of the appropriateness. And we address the need for rethinking the family environment with the patient, including very young patients, when they have the ability to understand the challenge, when they tell us about the challenge, and when they want to be present in addressing the challenge.
Thank you. With that, I will need to hop off, but as Dr. Strober said, those who are interested in continuing in the Q&A can feel free to leave their questions there. Thank you again, Mike. That was great.
So Tara or Ernie, do I click on Q&A?
Yep. And the questions will pop up as they're added.
There are no further questions. We can close the meeting at this time.
Okay, thank you, everybody.